both start by introducing your name and position, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm John Murphy. I'm the Strauss Curator Princeton Drawings here at the Loeb Art Center.
And I'm Ian Shelley. I am the Collections Curatorial Fellow here at the Loeb.
And then if you could, one of you could give like a short overview of Great Green Hope.
Yeah, the show really broadly is describing about 200 years of history of the way in which artists have engaged with the landscape around the Hudson Valley. So in a variety of media and practices.
And in some ways, it's one of those shows where what it's about is really in the title, Great Green Hope for the Urban Blues. In what ways has the Hudson Valley been seen and perceived to be a place of refuge and respite and escape and utopian experiment for people who are trying to get away from all the ills of urban industrial experience?
Why has the Hudson Valley been so attractive to artists as a subject?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in some ways, it's why does the Hudson Valley continue to be a place that people really want to visit, travel to, live in. It's beautiful. The scenery is gorgeous. It's picturesque. But I think for artists, one of the big advantages is its proximity to New York. So one of the major cultural epicenters in the world is accessible by train, by bus. You can come up for a day trip. You can come for part of a summer. There's an active arts community here, an ecosystem of museums and artist residencies and galleries. So for a lot of reasons, it's really tethered to the city and is part of, I'd say, the larger urban ecosystem of New York.
And I think also what we came to through doing a lot of research into this longer history of artists in this area is in some ways it is a kind of enchanted landscape beyond its just physical beauty. There are so many myths and stories that are completely and inextricably connected to various landmarks, stories that were created both 200 years ago, before that, and also that have continued to be made. And so it really is a land of kind of myth-making, which isn't necessarily specific to this region. But what we've noticed is there is this kind of proliferation of very particular land-based storytelling in this area, and that access to that storytelling through these infrastructural connections to New York City, only further intensify them, I think.
So, John, you talked about like the scenery and the picturesque qualities of the Hudson Valley as one of the draws for artists. I guess my second question is, what are the limits of investigating the identity and history of the Hudson Valley through art, like especially this art that takes the like aesthetic or picturesque qualities of nature?
Yeah, no, I think it's one of the themes of the show and really the recurring themes of people making art up in the Hudson Valley is they're drawn to the beauty of the Hudson Valley. They're drawn to the beauty of the river and of the mountains and the picturesque scenery, the old abandoned farmsteads, and it sort of evokes all of these nostalgic associations. But in some ways, by painting it and portraying it, they're also creating and participating in particularly a tourist economy, reasons that people are coming up to the city. So it's this constant struggle or tension of artists who are coming out portraying what they perceive to be sort of untrammeled wilds and beauties of the Hudson Valley, but they're a part of a tourist economy, and they're also contributing to a desire for people to come visit and see the Catskill Falls and take the steamboat up the river and spend time at an Airbnb or at the Catskill Mountain House, a hotel. So that tension was there from the beginning. We have, there's a wood engraving in the exhibition that's from Harper's Weekly that shows painters and photographers out at Catskill Falls. And even in the 1860s, there was already this sense that it was overrun by tourists and overrun by painters and overrun by writers and poets who were extolling the beauties of this supposedly unpeopled landscape, but in fact was already so much a part of kind of an extended urban system that really, however far you try to get away from New York always was following you and was always right there. So I think that tension of the myth of this beautiful landscape and the reality of what it looks like in terms of a growing population, growing modernization, railroads, steamboats, tourist hotels, those things being in constant tension is really one of the themes of the show.
And I think we were really conscious about the objects that we chose in an attempt to illustrate that tension. I think for the most part, we didn't try to bring in landscapes that were simply beautiful or simply aesthetically pleasing to us. Even in those 19th century landscapes that we might show, we usually tried to have something in the subject or something in the history or biography of the artist that would add a little bit of critique to that vision. So, for example, in an 1881 painting by Sanford Robinson Gifford of the Tappan Zee, it's really beautiful, atmospheric, these wonderful oranges in the sky, but there's a train going through the background, right, that's almost obscured by the autumnal foliage. And that's the exact same train that Gifford would have taken as he was coming up from the city. But he almost erases it, right? So even in those scenes that on the surface seem so beautiful, we always tried to pick works that would illustrate the tension within the actual subject. And so you can see that through both our choice of the historical works, like the wood engraving, and also from contemporary works, like the painting by Sandow Burke of the Shamgon Correctional Facility, which has the aesthetic of a Hudson River School painting, however, places a correctional facility in the background to discuss the carceral landscape of this space. So I think what we were most interested in is this kind of superficial veneer of seductive nature, and how the second that you dig beyond that layer, you start to see really interesting things.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. That's really the reason that we opened the show with the Sandow Burke painting. It's a bit of a manifesto statement right at the outset, a sort of curatorial statement of purpose, because it's a painting by a contemporary artist, California-based, that is done completely in the style of the Hudson River School. So from a distance, as you're approaching it, I think you're looking at a really beautiful example of a Hudson River School painting. Beautiful tree, cows lolling beneath the tree, beautiful sunset. And it's only as you start to look closer and get closer to the painting and examine it that you see elements that don't quite fit with what you would expect. There's power lines, there's contemporary sort of suburban houses, and then deep in the background there's a prison. And it turns out that this was part of a series that Burke had made that was portraying each maximum security prison in the Hudson Valley, but in the style of the Hudson River School. And so beginning the show with that painting, the idea was to alert visitors or viewers to be cautious or be careful about being seduced by the beauty of these landscapes, by the beauty of the Hudson River School style. Of course, these artists, going back to the 19th century, loved the scenery and loved this area and loved the geography and often chose to live here or spend part of the year here. But it can be seductive, and we wanted to also invite people to think about what those landscapes are obscuring or are not showing. And I think that Burke really put those two elements in tension right at the beginning of the show.
You've touched on this a bit, but I'm interested in hearing in a bit more detail how you would describe like the thematic role of New York City in the exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the title of the show is Great Green Hope for the Urban Blues, and that is kind of meant to represent this dichotomy is the simple word to describe it, essentially, of the Hudson Valley and New York City, right? The urban blues is this stand-in for everything that is about the urban malaise of skyscrapers and concrete in opposition to this supposedly forested utopia of upstate New York. And, in reality, I think what we found through a lot of our research and also just living in this place in the Hudson Valley is that New York City and the Hudson Valley kind of meet each other. They are completely co-constitutive. They rely on each other to both create that utopia and to create that urban blues in a lot of ways. And so New York City is a through line through every single piece in the show. Every single artist had studios or lived in New York City at one point, really, and then came up here, we're brought in by the gravitational pull of the Hudson Valley in some way. So I think New York City is really kind of this spectral presence that brings us through the show in a way.
Yeah, I think we were looking for paintings that would imply the presence of New York in them, not always really obviously. We don't have images explicitly of New York City, but it's there constantly in the background, looming. So I think of a painting by Arnold Wiltz, for example, of the Ashokan Reservoir. So it was painted in the 1930s, but he's painting a reservoir that was built in the early 20th century, effectively to send fresh water to New York City. The population was growing, the demands for fresh water were urgent, and so this reservoir, this lake, is constructed. It involves displacing thousands of people from the community that was there, takes over 10,000 acres, and for the people who were sort of dispossessed of their property and their homes and their communities, it was somewhat traumatic. But the needs of the city, the infrastructural needs, superseded and outweighed the needs of the country. And over time, oddly enough, the Ashokan Reservoir becomes naturalized as part of the scenery here. Painters paint it. You can go for a hike there to this day, and it looks like just a beautiful lake in the mountains. But the fact that when you're going for a hike at the Ashokan Reservoir, you're actually part of the water system of New York City was one of those moments in the show where we wanted to remind visitors that binary, that division between city and country is arbitrary. It's not real. The two are so inextricably linked in so many ways that you can't draw a distinct line between them.
Next, I'm curious about the kind of like religious connotations of a lot of imagery surrounding these like picturesque depictions of the Hudson Valley. Like there's kind of an Edenic sort of sense of space created, and then a lot of like, there's like, in the show I noticed like a lot of like bathers, kind of like Adam and Eve figures. And I'm just curious about like the origins of those religious connotations and like kind of what they mean for you in like terms of the mythology of the region.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say the landscape painter Thomas Cole, who was this so-called founder of the Hudson River School, this boom of landscape painting, starting around 1825 and going through the 19th century. He first took a trip up the Hudson River in 1825, and this year marks the 200th anniversary of that event. And that was kind of one of the reasons that we thought of this show in the first place. But Thomas Cole, in his famous essay on American scenery, where he extols the beauty of the American scene and its landscape and asks people in this country to recognize the true unique quality of this space. He has a line near the end of the essay where he says, "We are still in Eden," right? And so this idea that the United States and the Hudson Valley as this kind of representation of the United States in some ways was a promised land was baked into landscape art from the very beginning in this country. It was always a kind of primeval forest with biblical connotations. And that idea that we are still in Eden, or we need to get back to Eden, or we need to create Eden, really does come back up in writings and the ideologies of various artistic movements through the following centuries and decades.
Yeah, and I think that idea of utopia or Eden, it often implies a who's in and who's out utopia. For who, for what audience, for what folks are able to actually kind of think of the Hudson Valley as an Eden. And I think it had a lot to do with this idea that the city, New York, is a kind of hellscape of crowds and disease and concrete and steel and glass, and it's so removed in a lot of this iconography and a lot of this way of thinking from the natural, from the organic, and I think that persists really up until today. So we were interested in tracking that and the idea of the Adam and Eve, this sort of two figures, bathing in a creek or just enjoying nature outdoors. it comes up again and again in photographs and screen prints and engravings. You just see it as a recurring motif. And so we became interested in the idea of, if this is cropping up over and over again, what is it doing? What does it mean? And I think it goes to this idea that for various artists, for different art movements and groups, there is this feeling that the Hudson Valley represented some kind of promised land or some kind of escape, actual or kind of metaphorical, from just the ennui and whatever it was that the city represented as being kind of the opposite of this place of innocence. And it's a lyric from Joni Mitchell's famous song Woodstock, "We've got to get ourselves back to the garden." It's the idea that she was writing at the height of the Vietnam War. Cities, urban culture, modernity, it represents war and violence and corruption and commerce and commodification. And if only we could get back to some kind of mythical garden, which of course never really existed, but the Hudson Valley becomes kind of a stand-in for, then maybe we can reconnect with something more innocent and pure in our own natures that could be sort of expressed through these images.
You touched on this a bit in that answer, and so there's like these sort of religious view of utopia that's like kind of thought of through as, you know, through the vocabulary of Eden, but there's also like sort of, you're getting out of like the Joni Mitchell, like this sort of like Woodstock era like category of this more like secular utopia. I was thinking of like Birdcliff, like the farm, and like Cape Millet, and like the presence of Woodstock as well, and like even like the Borscht Belt, which is like a commercial enterprise, is still like this site of like solidarity and community building that represents escape from the city. I guess in thinking about these kind of utopian dreams that are more dissociated from their religious roots, and like how to read them, like how to read their like genuine subversive energies alongside their like participation in the violent histories of like the myths that they like kind of propagate and buy into, whether consciously or not.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it was one of the is something we tried to balance in the show, was both a criticism and you know, thinking about the ideology of a kind of settler colonial way of thinking of the Hudson Valley as this unpeopled paradise that really existed just for the benefit of people who were settling here in the 19th century. But at the same time, there's been genuine kind of countercultural movements. I was thinking of the farm, the Cape Millet farm that's close here to Vassar campus, only about 10 minutes away, and it was established in the late 70s by Kate Millett. She'd written an important feminist book, Sexual Politics, and she'd been living in the Bowery and was looking for a place to create a utopian community, a kind of queer feminist collective where women could get away from the city, could create and carve out kind of their own space of art making and creativity and self-expression. And then they harvested Christmas trees to sell in the city, so there was already this kind of funny city-country dynamic. But the impulse to create a space apart from mainstream society that had certain expectations and certain normative ideas of how people are supposed to be and supposed to act and who, you know, how they're supposed to live their lives. The Hudson Valley has been a space where people have genuinely tried to do something different, to carve out some kind of anti-hegemonic way of living. I think the farm is a good example of that. Birdcliff, the arts and crafts colony in the early 20th century, it's an arts and crafts movement that was very much based on getting back to some artisanal, handcrafted way of making objects that would be very different from industrial, mass manufactured commodities. And so, I mean, it's both kind of easy to make fun of in a way, but also I think we tried to recognize like what the desires were behind some of those countercultural movements, and what we could kind of retain or even learn from. Why did those desires exist in the first place, and why did the Hudson Valley become a place where it seemed like some of these experiments could happen? So trying to keep those two ideas in mind was for us both one of the appealing things to the theme, but also one of the challenges.
Yeah, I think we kept coming back to the question of are these still useful places and ideas to think with today? And I think the answer that we came to is just that it's very complicated. There's a lot of bad things that were tied up in these ideologies of countercultural movements, and a lot of really productive and wonderful things that came out of them as well. And the myths that they kept propagating about returning to the landscape were particularly of interest to us, I think. There was the one artist that you said that I think was part of the Maverick, who said that when they were first moving to the Maverick, they were living like pioneers, right? And so that was also tied up in all of these back to the garden movements and back to the land movements, a desire to get back to the 19th and 18th centuries and relive these rugged days of the past. And that's also like they were literally reliving kind of settlement mythologies at the same time. So that was also part of this. It's all quite complicated.
And many of them become disillusioned too once they arrive. One of the founders of the Maverick, a kind of spin-off art community from Birdcliff, had been a social worker in Chicago, and he moves to upstate and sets up this kind of bohemian anarchist community of artists and musicians and writers. And he recognizes that, he even writes an essay called Our Rural Slums. He's recognizing that the children of quarry workers and migrant laborers, and there's poverty in the Catskill Mountains. There's not just beautiful forests and rolling rivers and picturesque scenery. There's real hardship here. There's real economic disparity. There's real struggle. And so to see through the eyes of people who are coming with this utopian idea, then encounter the reality of what it actually looks like to live here. And he said it looked a lot like the slums of Chicago, where he'd been a social worker. He didn't see there as being such a distinction between the two. And so to recognize that the myth, often the scales sort of fall from people's eyes at some point, and the reality behind the myth is what they're ultimately left with.
So now, talking a bit more about like the Loeb and this exhibition, not just thematically, but in terms of like its like process and position to like what the Loeb is working on. Just generally, like first, would you guys be able to speak a bit to the process of curating the show?
Well, it really started as John's show, and it was originally called City and Country. And it was much more about that, the explicitly showing illustrations of that binary of New York City and the Hudson Valley. And then John asked me to join on, and I started researching more and more. And then one day I was in his office, and he said, you're a co-curator on this, right? And I was like, okay, sure. But I think the co-curatorial process is so baked into what this exhibition is about, a lot of it was us bouncing ideas off of each other and bringing our various expertises to this space. The reason that I first came onto this project was because I've done a lot of research into our collection of 19th century American landscapes, and John, he won't talk about this because he won't brag at all, but he wrote his PhD dissertation on the Woodstock Art Colony. And so, it was really a melding of a lot of the things that we had worked on in the past. And obviously John knows way more about the Woodstock Art Colony than I know about anything else in the entire world. But and then we also wanted to bring in contemporary art as well, and that's neither of our specialties. And so we kind of just bumbled along there and picked out artists who we thought were doing really interesting things. But I think it was really a pleasure to work on a project that's so local, which doesn't often happen at the Loeb. But we just took a lot of road trips and went to a lot of artist studios and saw different museums, and it was kind of nice getting to recognize the ecosystem of places around here, and see in a lot of ways what the Hudson Valley still has to offer. And doing that together, of course, was the main joy of the project.
Cheers. Yeah, I mean, the thing I would just add is, the process was really conversational, was really collaborative when you're co-curating something. And of course, there's the whole team here at the Loeb where everything becomes a conversation with our colleagues. We were drawing a lot on the collection, so previous works that had come into the collection through our colleagues who'd acquired really fantastic photographs and prints and paintings. We were relying on a lot of that expertise. And then just the reminder that the Loeb is a part of the larger ecosystem here of institutions that are really interested in this regional history. So from the Thomas Cole site to Olana to the Dorsky Museum to the FDR Library, there's just a lot of knowledge and expertise here. So we borrowed things from other institutions, and then this continues to be a place where our artists are making work and often responding to, critiquing, or in some kind of dialogue with the longer history of art making in the Hudson Valley. So one of the works that really features prominently right at the beginning of the show is a painting by Lisa Sanditz, who teaches at Bard College. And that for us was another example of a painting that was really doing so much conceptual work for the show. It was helping us get at ideas that we wanted the show to really be about, which was Lisa's both acknowledging and in some ways honoring this longer history. Thomas Cole painted the Catskill Falls. That's the subject of her painting on his trip in the 1820s. But she's giving it this new life and intensity, and it has these vibrant kind of cotton candy colors, and she has figures in it who are at Catskill Falls but are also busy looking at their iPhones. So the idea of our experience of nature now is so mediated, and so much about kind of this place is becoming a commodity, a tourist attraction, a place you visit and spend money to go see. But what we loved about it was that was also true in the 1820s. It wasn't like that's true now and it wasn't true then. In the 1820s, if you went to Catskill Falls, there were a series of dams to release the water at particular times over the falls when there were a lot of tourists who wanted to see the sublime in action. We love the fact that someone who's a contemporary artist, who's teaching at Bard, is speaking back to this longer history and helping us see it in new and different ways and bringing a lot of these ideas to life. That it was those kinds of conversations that I think made it such a pleasure.
Yeah, and I'll add also, we really couldn't have done this show if it hadn't been for the previous collecting work of our deputy director, Mary Kay Lombino, and also our curator of photography, Jess Breyer, who've done a really good job over the past decades, really, of bringing in local Hudson Valley artists. And so Lisa Sanditz was a work that Mary Kay brought into the collection. And the second that John and I saw it, we kind of knew that it was the banner image for the show. And so, when we were able to create this as a mostly collections-based show, mostly from work in the Loeb's collection, really because of that longer commitment to bringing in art from the Hudson Valley in a way.
My last kind of question is about what role this exhibition plays in this larger, more ongoing project of reinstalling and reinterpreting the Loeb's collection of Hudson River School paintings,
So the exhibition, it's funny, usually when you work on an exhibition, it goes on the walls, comes down, and then you move on, you're on to the next project, and it sort of exists in its own history and in its own life. But this will have an ongoing life. This is really, Ian and I were testing some of the first ideas for reinstalling our significant collection of Hudson River School paintings. So there's a collection of over 70 paintings that dates back really to the beginnings of the college as part of a bequest from Matthew Vassar himself of work by then living contemporary artists of the Hudson River School. And there's a suite of 3 galleries dedicated to those paintings that we're in the process of just thinking about what are new approaches to those galleries that we could take, new frameworks, new ways of thinking about how to display them, how to interpret them, how to engage faculty and classes across campus. So Great Green Hope was really a chance for us to just try out some different strategies and approaches. What would it look like to bring in different media, for example. Bring in prints, bring in photographs, bring in sketchbooks, think about process. What would it look like to mix in contemporary art with historical art? What kind of conversations would that generate? What would it look like if we went beyond the 19th century and thought about the longer cultural history of the Hudson Valley through the 20th century up until today? So really not to suggest that Great Current Hope is just a selfish and self-indulgent exercise, but really it did have that ulterior purpose of getting started this thinking around reinstalling those collections of 19th century American landscape paintings.
That's pretty much it, yeah.